Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It is the November 25th. Wow, that's crazy. Of the first year social hour. Today, I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Jennifer Scuro from the philosophy department, and she is going to be discussing disability and bioethics. Dr. Scuro and I teach a core class together. She is a wonderful colleague of mine, and I'm excited to hear what she has to share with us. And I think it's very relevant for all of our students, not just our first year students. So thank you, Dr. Scuro. We really are so happy to have you here today.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad I'm doing this. I'm an FST instructor. I am also teaching a coordinated class with FST Philosophy 1000. So we were invested in the Plant Hunter this year. And it's very relevant for like what I do. So I do philosophy and ethics. So there's like a nice combo. And I have a slideshow that has a QR code. So if anybody wants to follow along, they can have access to it because I have a bunch of like video links and links to things like full textbooks that we have available in the JET library. So hopefully the slideshow provides some resources because I tend to offer a lot of information. I I believe. All right, so I don't think I'm visible, but that's okay. I think that's the case. So I'll leave this here for a second, and I'll just talk a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today. This is about disability and bioethics, but I put the bio in parentheses for a reason. I'm primarily an ethicist, and my most of my graduate career in philosophy has been working on post-Holocaust ethics, contemporary ethics related to disability, gender, race, class, bias. And global history in relation to ethics. So very often the kind of ethics I do is a version of an applied ethics. So, and just as a kind of shout out to the philosophy department, we have a minor in bioethics and we have a minor in applied ethics. So this is also where I'm kind of showcasing a little bit of like what happens if a student takes a in a bioethics class or takes an ethics class and what we consider or what is the kind of overarching goals of studying ethics and kind of being literate in the things that ethics can provide. So now that that is there, I'm just going to move that along. Let's see. Okay, so I wrote a book in 2017 called Addressing Ableism and Philosophical Questions via Disability Studies. So as a philosopher, I came to this very interdisciplinary field of study called disability studies. Um, and in doing that, taking what I already knew, I was bringing lots of questions to this field I didn't know a lot about. And then I really invested in this question about ableism proper. And when I was writing the book, it was still one of those words that's like misspelled. So now people might know what it is, but the goal of the book was really to map out what ableism means and I ended up with these three strategies. What is it to identify ableism? What is it to resist ableism? And what is it to confront ableism? Because those three things are really different. They're different strategies, they're different kind of labors, different techniques. And very often the people who were identifying ableism weren't always in a position to resist ableism. And the people who were resisting ableism weren't always in a position to be able to confront ableism. So I felt like I was setting up a nice set of like cataloging, if you like, the strategies. One of the things that came early on was that ableism is a kind of Western somatophobia. It's basically a way of saying in the Western world, a lot of what comes with our feelings about the body, our perceptions about what a body can or can't do, about living or being embodied, tends to be full of language around deficit and deficiencies, and then we're always struggling to overcome that, including those cultural perceptions. And sometimes I was, talking a lot about things like even these affections we have for ableism. Ableism being the bias, I had to really go in and and look into like how is ableism operating as if it's a neutral thing, as if it's like permissible. So casual ableism, where people would really kind of perceive anything related to disability as already something to intervene. Either they were afraid of it, or there's always this preference to be non-disabled or to be able-bodied against anything resembling disability. And that fear and that affection for being able-bodied and the fear of disability was something that I was finding in this mapping activity. And so an even better version of ableism is here by Talia Lewis. Ableism is a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on a socially constructed idea of normalcy, intelligence, excellence, and productivity. So when I do a lot of my work, whether it's a philosophy of ed class where it's not about ethics, or it's about, in my bioethics class or my disability and ethics class, I'm looking for common themes that we can all identify, whether we are disabled or non-disabled. And very often the kind of values we place on things like intelligence or productivity or normalcy tend to be signs that we're actually accepting or permitting a certain amount of ableism, to the degree that what ableism is a kind of violence, it's a kind of harm. So that's part of why I really liked, you know, kind of looking into the question of disability through the lens of ableism as an ethicist might. Where's the bias? Where is the harms? Where can we kind of identify that work? And for many of you, if you're going into a service profession, you already know that there's all these ways in which a client or a patient might have things that they need from you, and your own internalized ableism might be operating without you even realizing and interfere with the quality of care you can deliver in a professional setting. So very often, whether in bioethics or even in my other classes in philosophy, the idea of like unpacking one's own internalized bias around disability becomes kind of fundamental. If anything, it's really important from that first semester or that first year in college. So I like that last comment there. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism, which I think is kind of my access point for me, but also for my students, and thinking about why one would study disability or why one would study bioethics in a way that was meaningful. And and Lee Brown has written extensively um, as an undergrad, and then as a through law school, and has been an activist, and I think now is a professor teaching at Georgetown. Has written a bunch of really important pieces. Also was an interlocutor. They were part interlocutor with one of the chapters in my book on intersectionality and ableism. And I just love this quote: disability in an ableist world, few outside of the disability community ever consider the consequences of their perceptions and limited understanding of disability, and many whose views are shaped by unsound and dangerous ideas continue to perpetuate ableism without ever having their privilege challenged and examined. Disability exists because we are largely complacent in allowing ourselves and society to perpetuate a world where disabled people are marginalized and oppressed by attitudinal and systemic barriers to access. So the theme of accessibility and what that means is going to be one of those kind of additional key strategies in doing not only bioethics, but what I'm going to call a disability bioethics. And that's really what I'm offering today, is not necessarily just about disability identity or what it is to seek out and learn from disabled people and their experience about how the world works in terms of its bias, in terms of its harm, but also then to kind of build strategies that are really world shaping and perspective changing. So the disability bioethics is part of this presentation today. So this might be something that is surprising. And if you are disabled, and you don't get a lot of opportunities to talk through what it is to identify as disabled, but not as if your disability is a deficit, you might seek out some of the additional links here, including what ableism looks like when people use it in everyday language. When people say you're crazy or you're stupid, I think we have come to make that really normal, and as if it's like as a kind of casual ableism in our everyday lives. And so this is also where, as you become literate, you suddenly become aware of the fact that the more we use language like this, the more we're I call it passing the hot potato of ableism back and forth, of just like the things that we deem less valuable or less important, and the things that we want to kind of that we're aiming for or desiring very often is around things that have to do with ableist harm. So I just love that you are not a burden. I didn't link it here, but we did, I think it was last April. um uh Lee Brown came to over a Zoom recording, um neurodiversity and belonging with Malloy. And we had a great chat. And we had a student come on, and we all had a discussion about what does it mean to what does neurodiversity mean, and what does belonging or creating communities that are based on neurodiversity and models of neurodiversity. We have a bit of a history with working with them, and real insights too. So what's bioethics? For some of you, you might be going into the health professions, if you're going to the therapeutic professions. Um, but at any point, this is really kind of like a handy toolkit just generally for ethics. But bioethics in particular really began out of both a combination of the Holocaust. Again, you hear that where my work comes from is after something like a genocide, capable of great um, great mass scale damage, that you have this ability to like um, reframe what it means to be a human, what it means to be in the world, without this assumption that we need to fix, cure, or manipulate the lives of people for some kind of like eugenic goal. So eugenics comes up a lot in the work of bioethics, particularly in relation to disability. But the assumption is what's the underlying principle is the Hippocratic Oath. Do no harm, right? This do no harm principle is the one that really we start the class with. But the paradigm shift began after the Holocaust with really saying what what does informed consent look like when it comes around things like dignity or human rights or autonomy, when it comes to like any medical advances, technological advances. And again, bioethics, I have a link there. If you look, the green with the underline is actually a link to the reading that we use in my bioethics class. It's like an introductory text on bioethics. So if people are really super interested, this is really a good starting point just to get base literacy. And sometimes bioethics has been like an academic field among professionals. So like doctors and nurses will, hospital boards will use bioethics to be able to make decisions and to improve practice. Bioethicists become a great place to develop ethical standards, best practices, sometimes they say. But even for research, not just healthcare and medicine, but any kind of advancement in knowledge, appealing to the bioethicists sometimes is a really good reinforcer of basic questions. And then the other kind of way in which we see the domain of bioethics being used is in practical applications of everyday life, including political policy. And so when I think of bioethics, it looks like it is one of those fields that sounds very complicated, but I do think it's one of those things that helps navigate the stuff that is every day very complicated, like our political landscape. Bioethics can be the way to kind of get out of these pro-con debates that sometimes people associate with ethical discussions. The pro-con, where people are debating positions, that kind of political discourse, I think ethics takes us out of that like back and forth and the antagonistic quality to something like, but what's at stake here? What's the larger question that we're really concerned about? So, also it's been a great resource for me personally, but as a professor, I've always found how very liberating it is for a lot of students who only know the political discourses and only know the kind of landscape that tends to be a little tough, a little confrontational. And we do take it seriously. Most of these debates are not where we're above the debate, but we really get into the debate to be able to navigate the heart of the debate. And that's where I always find this a really such an intriguing toolkit to learn about. So every bioethics class, every bioethicist, everybody who knows anything about bioethics knows about the four principles. I won't say much more, but I will say those are the four: autonomy, beneficence, non-malfeasance, and justice. When you go to the primary readers, they always have like, charts and graphs. I think I have one that I use for my class. But basically, this idea of like autonomy is that I am self-moving, I am self-determining. Beneficence is that there is a good that is done or a benefit to be had. Non-malfeasance, I am not to be harmed. And justice, that things are fair and they're based on some overarching principle of fairness. And so there's a nice quote here, but I won't say more. It's really important that when we think about large scale ethical problems, or even if something is really in your own life complicated, you might go through and do a little checklist. What's at stake here? Is it about me being independent and self-determining? Is it about some good that I'm seeking? Is it about something where I'm trying to protect myself from harm? Or is it about like basic fairness? Am I treated equally? Am I treated like others? Or am I treated exceptionally and unfairly? It's a great toolkit. So again, in just kind of like capping off what is bioethics, and why I think it's a great minor to study, whether or not you're interested in philosophy. I don't think that's necessarily why students study bioethics, but very often it is this additional complement to whatever you're studying, because it allows you a leadership role when things get really messy and things get really in the muck, that you can say, all right, well, what about like one's ability to not be harmed? And you get to say something that kind of takes the conversation to a next level. So I always think that this is what's so nice about it. A lot of the bioethics sometimes is just an expanded view of medical ethics. That's not what we do. Or at least that's not what I do when I do bioethics. Sometimes it is like this large scope kind of supervisory study over things like other forms of ethics, medical ethics, animal ethics, environmental ethics, public health ethics, and things like that. And again, an applied ethics minor, you'd study maybe the different components of ethics, including like business ethics. But I think sometimes bioethics takes that role of being like, but we cover all things. The word, of course, bios is Greek for life. So if it involves life, we want to be part of it, right? But this is really the work I do in bioethics, is dealing just with the phenomenon that wherever life is, it's not limited in our interests and in our maybe advocacy, just in terms of the functional life sciences. That's why I put a little arrow there. This is us. So, one person I just love referencing, because there's a film on Netflix called Crip Camp that features Judy Human. And there's like, she was one of the first activists to really help move disability rights in the States. So the principle of the disability rights movement is nothing about us without us, right? Because very often a lot of the medical or guardianship decision making was always something about them without them. And what I love about disability studies is that we study kind of these early movements in the 20th century of disability rights movements that led to real policy change. And Judy Human was one of the forerunners. She actually was featured on an episode of Drunk History. I am not endorsing it, but it is really good. It's such a great profile, comedic. But again, she put out a memoir. There's a little clip here about her role in the disability rights movement. Um, but
If you
she's a great resource. For ethical concepts, disability studies is not the same as, but overlaps with the kind of four pillars approach that bioethics takes, where you see the word autonomy here, right? So that's repeated. But with disability studies, we also include as an ethical concept the concept of identity. Again, this idea of like who we are and how we are represented in the world, or how we would like to identify ourselves in the world. The ability to self-identify and lay claim to one's own identity is really key in disability. I think a lot of times disability is a checked box or a private category, something to hold behind closed doors. But this is really where what I love about disability studies is that the the disability pride movement is included. This idea that like, not only am I disabled, but like people should listen to what I have to say about how to improve the world, or people should learn from what I know by being disabled. And the communities that disabled people share tend to be these communities that are creative and joyful. And this month on campus is Disability Awareness Month. And so there's a bunch of events that we've planned. And one of them is, I think it's on December 10th. We're going to have a sing along after the after the Christmas party. And the sing along is going to have a music specialist sign interpreter. And everybody comes and sings along. So it's disability centered. I just I think this is kind of the wonderful thing about disability and as an ethical concept, this concept of identity. So oh, no, yes, thank you. And so the other concepts that come out of identity is, what is oppression look like? Like, what is it when one is confined or limited in ways that are categorical, stereotyping? And the concept there you can see is called hegemonic power. This idea that like everybody's got to kind of play the game, and everybody's kind of powerless against that machinery of the bureaucracy of life, right? That everybody's got their role to play, and nobody's really able to transgress those roles in any way. The problem with hegemonic power is that it feels like that's the way it is and that's the way it's going to be. It's natural. This is how it works, right? That's the way the world works. And I think as an ethicist, the good news is just because that's the way it is doesn't mean that's the way it ought to be. There's a kind of moral injunction that always is beyond that kind of confinement, that if it's already in operation, there's absolutely nothing that says you're morally obliged to keep it up, especially if it is oppressive and harmful and in some ways goes against basic ethical injunctions like do not harm. So the other concept there, again, there's like a editing of the concept of autonomy out of the bioethics community into the disability community, where this power of self-determination is regardless of one's capacity. I think there's always this problem of thinking like one doesn't know well enough for themselves if they're disabled, what's good for them. And so the idea is that at every turn, a disabled person is autonomous as possible and has the things that they need to be able to demonstrate one's own choices, desires, language. And it's not special, it's not exceptional. There's even ableist connotations in the idea of like special needs, because the idea of autonomy belongs to everyone. When you're disabled in a world that is ableist, if anything, we have more reason to make the world equitable in relation to one's autonomy, and that one's ability or disability is irrelevant, right? So there's a little philosopher reference there. If anybody's interested in Kantian ethics, it's not that fancy, but basically it's this idea that we have a duty to uphold autonomy, not just for our own self, but for others. And sometimes the language is about dignity, dignity in relation to one's right, and one's power to self-determine. So here's the problem. A lot of the work in disability studies has run parallel but independent of bioethics. If anything, the work in bioethics and the field of bioethics tends to be academics who are able-bodied, and the world in disability studies has been mostly by disabled thinkers and activists, and not necessarily people who are scholars. And so this example is one of the classics. Peter Singer is a utilitarian philosopher. He's famous for his animal ethics. He's one that referenced in most bioethics classes. They will spend much time talking about Peter Singer's work. The problem is Peter Singer has also argued as a utilitarian that the suffering of anyone is always morally wrong, and we can never promote the suffering of anyone. That's why he's an animal activist. But he then says and extends that to disabled people to the point in which he's actually advocated for a kind of infanticide, that if there is a life that is born where it's going to be a life of disability and suffering, that that life does not have to exist. Like we can terminate that morally, a morally defensible argument at least. And so again, it is hard to promote Peter Singer in my bioethics class when you come across his actual views when it comes to disability. And so Harriet McBride, an activist, Harriet McBride Johnson, responded in a letter in the New York Times. And she says, at this stage of my life, he says, I'm a person. However, as an infant, I wasn't. I, like all humans, was born without self-awareness, and eventually, assuming my brain finally gets so fried that I fall into the wonderland where self and other and present and past and future blur into the boundless, formless, all or nothing, then I'll lose my personhood and therefore my right to life. Then he says, my family and doctors might well put me out of my misery or out of my bliss or oblivion, and no one would count it as murder. So she basically makes this very fair and very sound ethical claim against kind of one of the biggest titans in bioethics and ethics generally at the time, which I always think is kind of badass. So always my best example. So I try to think of ways to bridge, as somebody who really, my research has been on ableism, to bridge the concerns of disability studies and the relation to disability ethics with the concerns of bioethics. And one concept is stigma. I think this is where you see both stigma operate in disability in a way that could inform bioethics, and in some ways have it be more respectful of the domain of disability as a kind of pillar of where we should be directing future ideas and decisions about. So that KWDS is the keywords for disability studies. The link there is to the entire text. There are all these entry words about different words in disability studies, stigma being one. But what I love is like even concepts like what is it to stare, right? The idea of staring at a disabled person. And how is that an ethical question? How is it a question of bias? How is it benign and how is it not, right? Stigma affects our employment, social recognition, educational opportunities, friendships, sex, housing, freedom from violence. I think there are all these ways in which I think if we think in terms of stigma, what we get is a better insight into how ableism works, again, regardless of our disability position. But I have to say, disabled people really know in a way what to do and how to navigate or be protective over how stigma operates as an ableist harm, as an ableist violence. So again, a short version of this, disability history is a great resource for this. Even something like having been ugly was actually legally, you couldn't be out in public. If you were deemed ugly, there was something called ugly laws where you just couldn't even be out in the world. Really interesting if you look back at the history. I love the dunce cap image because I think sometimes when we think of our own education, the amount of ableism, and I teach this in my philosophy of ed class, it is pervasive. It's really hard to get around. So I have some slides here. Sorry about the sound. Let me move through that. So I work from Disability Bioethics. This is a piece by Rosemary Garland Thompson. She was cited earlier too, where she writes at length about disability bioethics. I tell my bioethics students they're always going to get a disability bioethics in their intro to bioethics. But the idea is that it becomes a really fundamental interdisciplinary approach. It's a critical disability studies, so it's kind of like not just disability studies where we just learn about disability history, rights, and things like that, but we really become a mechanism for change, which I love. And there's lots of concepts that come with critical disability studies. Um, and again, this is like some resources if you were interested in something like if you're going into service profession, if you are disabled, how your disability should be in some ways how you could be a leader in a field in terms of how professionally to do the good work. And I don't know if we always make that clear enough that it shouldn't just be able-bodied therapists and doctors taking care of the disabled. I think it should be where we're taking care of each other, but really almost in anti-ableist ways. So here's some more material on that. Um, and for my bioethics students, I always talk about cultural competence, but here there's a disability cultural competence. Disability is an experience, an identity, a culture that people enter unexpectedly and unwillingly Entering into disability requires more than medical treatment and rehabilitation. Becoming disabled requires adjusting to new functioning, appearance, and social status. It requires learning how to flourish as a person with disabilities, not just living as a disabled person trying to become non-disabled. I think that's one of the most powerful insights into like, what does it mean to be disabled? And this is one of the things I really wanted to kind of share with you because I don't always get to share it so clearly with my students in the classroom, but I think this is a really great opportunity for any of you to think about how our relationship, not just in terms of identity, but in our own perception of autonomy, to the degree to which autonomy sometimes is really its own labor and its own work, and we need communities to help us do that work of being autonomous and self-determining and free from harm. Here's a nice video clip. If you follow the QR code, you can see this is about a 14-minute discussion in which Judith Butler, gender theorist, and Sonora Taylor, disability writer and advocate, she wrote a book called Beasts of Burden, which talks about the relationship between animals and disabled people. It's really great. But again, how are even identity and autonomy, not just ethical concepts, but political concepts? So, you know, how can stuff that you discuss in an ethics class turn into a form of advocacy and agency over the way the world works? So I love that one too. Move past that, sorry. I did a podcast series. We only had our season 1 out, but here our own Dr. Engels joined us. It's Disability Bioethics as the Future of Bioethics. And so there's a whole it's like 2.5 hours. I don't expect anybody to listen to the whole thing, but there's some really key moments in here about like what could be included in a disability bioethics as the future of the work of bioethics. Um, so one of the outcomes today I hope you get is that when we think about our future practices, maybe as professionals or even personally, that we think about when we care for others, when we take care of others, but we do it in a way that's disability informed. How do we demonstrate real care about the lives of disabled and those who are most vulnerable? So that's a question that I think can be an outcome of just this little talk I'm doing with you. But I do think that like, how might I care for those around me independent of one's disability, but in ways that are really disability informed? In other words, I understand how ableism might operate regardless, interfering with one's self-determination and identification representation in the world. A concept from critical disability studies, concept of body mind, that you are not a body and a mind. You are not like just trying to get your body to do your intellectual bidding. I know many of you are tired and exhausted. So the concept in critical disability, maybe our body and minds are more like holistically connected, and that as a philosopher, it goes all the way back to this concept that somehow our bodies and our minds are two different things, and we kind of somehow have to get our bodies to conform. Here again, the Critical Disability Studies Collective have all these resources about like how creative the world gets and how we could be more creative in relation to our understanding of the world when we start thinking in terms of this holistic concept of body mind. My work right now is on the intersection of disability with trauma. I'm finding that relationship between trauma and onset disability, what happens, I think a lot of the activism had come from people, especially early on, from people who were born disabled. And I think when you're born disabled, a little less, there is a little less internalization of stigma because that's how you are, right? In some ways, there's this kind of sense of like, I don't know any other way. But when you have been able-bodied and then you become disabled, what I find is a lot of people um, have this perception that is extremely ableist and unpacked. And again, what does that mean in relation to trauma? How might that be some kind of, I'm finding that I can't get either way. So people who do the work in trauma don't have a lot of disability informed practices or strategies, and people in disability tend to have little resource in terms of what trauma is, because very often it's the domain of the therapists and the medical professionals. So, and I have some concepts there. I'm trying to get some grant funding to do more work in researching this idea of trauma and disability and its interrelation. So trauma-informed care, you might have heard of this if you are going into a service profession, but again, what does it mean to take on those sustained biases? How is a lot of our work around trauma and our perceptions of trauma also ableist? So there's also one of my insights. The famous piece here is called "The Body Keeps the Score." One of the things that trauma researchers found is that when it comes to trauma, it's like in the body, so that there is no talk therapy that can make it better. You can't talk yourself out of trauma. Your body already is programmed in trauma to respond to the world in ways that aren't easily overcome. So that's also one of the insights that's from this piece here. Another concept from disability justice, I think I'm almost done here too, is access intimacy, one of my favorite concepts. This concept is this idea that when you get to know people who know you, when you are in the world and there are things you can and can't do, or sensitivities or vulnerabilities you have, that when you're around people who get it, sorry, this is all this work you don't have to do. Sorry. I'm gonna pause for a sec. You might be able to take a minute to read. But Mia Mingus talks about how access intimacy is finding places, building communities where you don't have to do all the work of having to represent your needs, having to represent yourself. And it comes out of a concept of disability justice. It's the long pieces there, it's quite beautiful. But I find this concept to be one of the most useful and liberating when it comes to my own relationship to disability. Sorry. So disability justice, um, uh, creating space to tell disability stories in a way that remakes the world. I can create movements that are going to save my life, that aren't going to leave me behind. So Leah Lakshmi Pipesina Samrasina has a book called Care, Work, Dreaming Disability Justice. There is here a list of the 10 principles of disability justice. This is also coming out of the critical disability theory work that I do and people have been doing for quite a while now. There's 10 of them. They're wonderful. And I strongly recommend you come join us next Monday, noon to 1:30 in Hagen, because we are going to spend time doing some disability justice work, including rest, repair, and disability justice from this idea of the rest deck. The book is that it's based on is called Rest is Resistance, a manifesto by Tricia Hershey. And she writes about this idea of like the importance, the social justice component of the need for rest and repair. And we have this rest deck where it's 50 practices to resist grind culture. On the right there is a quote, "All bodies are caught in the bindings of ability, race, class, gender, sexuality, citizenship. We are powerful, not despite the complexities of our identities, but because of them. Only universal collective access can lead to universal collective liberation. This is disability justice." So Dr. Kavita Indar, Dr. Sarah Evans, and me, we're going to all set up basically time to we're gonna have like a workshop. It's gonna be like there's gonna be a daydreaming station, there's gonna be a napping station, a journaling station, and we're just gonna talk about like the need to resist grind and to be able to rest and relax. Um, so that's the heart of my presentation. And I hope you join us. We can send up we'll send out the QR code too if you want to follow along or catch any of those links. But that's the heart of what I've my own research, my teaching, but the relationship between disability and bioethics is kind of tense and hard. It's not a smooth connection. So I imagine that, especially here at Malloy, we've been really creating this like third option when it comes to like the schoolwork we have to do and the kind of way in which we can like be messy bodies doing that work and like still enjoy ourselves and still learn so much. And again, the power of growth when you are cared for and you are tended to and you're able to engage in like real time spent cultivating your sense of self, right? Your self-determination and your ability to be autonomous.
That's really wonderful. I think it's something that we take for granted, especially as if we're able-bodied individuals. So I think that that message is really important. I'm just thinking for our students on here, and I know many of who are in or planning to go into those service professions. What if they wanted to take a course with you, what would be if they're interested in this bioethics, either as a minor or just to learn more by taking some of the courses, what would you recommend as next steps for them?
Well, we have an intro to bioethics, and we do have a disability and ethics class. Those are taught either by me or my colleague, Dr. Engels. You saw that there. And then, um, and I think especially when it comes to like sustained study, the good thing about the minor is a lot of the classes are like open-ended electives, and then there's a capstone. So an advanced bioethics class, it would be like researching something completely in your interest that you can work really independently. And some of my bioethics students have researched like the coolest stuff and discovered things like out there in the world about, one did a project on companies that deal in infertility and how a lot of them people were seeking resources, and there were these like almost profiteering agencies and
Yeah.
found all these kind of really dodgy websites and went down this rabbit hole. It was this beautiful research because what it was kind of cataloging what's out there when you don't have support, when you don't have any resources and you seek it out and then you get taken advantage of, right? So it was like just really wonderful work. And I think and again, the idea of doing ethics is so complicated anyway. It's a gen ed requirement, and I think when students have those requirements, it's very often a box checked. And I just, when it comes time for you to take it, if you're not already taking an ethics class for that general ed requirement, just think of it as your opportunity to really explore third options when it comes to things where that confrontation or those things where you are just you don't feel heard, or the positions or the point of view that you have um feels like there is no reception, right? There's no way to this is how I feel, this is what I want, or why don't you see it my way? I feel like so many times we are in a culture that doesn't really give us time to kind of do those kinds of dialogues. And I think we have events around that too. Dr. Ponzer sometimes has I think the Braver Angels comes once a
Yeah.
semester. They come and have these debates, and they're really difficult debates. I think they just had it on AI,
Yeah, yeah.
and
That's
it
the last one.
tends to be the most fruitful because there's some rules to that. At the end of my bioethics class, we're going to be doing it, I think, next week. We actually have like an ethics bowl where we debate cases and we use strategies, and we just take these, it could be anything, and just really um, kind of use whatever we've learned, whatever literacy we have, and in some ways, if not you, who, right? So sometimes advocating or arguing for things, there really is no one else to do it. So I always think of ethics as this kind of work of, as the more you learn it, the more you realize that you could so take a leadership position. And a lot of my students walk away from classes really, I find that they are like peers when it comes to like, why might we do this and not that? Their decision making is always so instructive to me, not just I'm the instructor to them. So I think ethics can be a great way to kind of imagine yourself as being able to be someone that people go to for real insight in how to do things and live a better life, or be able to change the things that are the most harmful, or conditions that really one finds oneself without resource.
Great. I'm going to go to our students who've joined us today. So if anybody has any questions or comments or needs more resources, we'd love to hear from, I think we have 8 or 9 students on today. So that's great. It's a great turnout. And I know we've got a future educator, a bunch of nurses, some of the names that I recognize. So definitely part of our service group, service majors. Maybe some of our nursing students who haven't taken an ethics course, maybe have some questions on what that might look like for your particular major. Everybody's being quiet.
Well,
So it might.
uh, I I could talk up the event for next week because
Sure,
I'm
absolutely.
so
Share it.
excited about this. So it's actually called the Nap Ministries Rest Deck, and it's all these prompts on like I think just even something like the concept of rest when it comes to like the trauma and disability work that I'm doing, there's just no time to like repair and rest. I think we're always like busy or we're always, you know, that we're always running out of time and we don't get enough rest, we don't get enough sleep. And I always tell my students like there's been studies that like they made people play really difficult video games and for hours and hours and they were, running up against all these obstacles and their gameplay was whatever. And then some of them they let sleep for 12 hours and some of them they didn't. And what they found is the people who got to sleep and rest came back and played better. Like there was something about like your brain was able to reset. So like I think when we go into, this level of work, sometimes we think, oh, all night cramming or, I'll work all night on this like how important your sleep is can be one insight you get from like that and good quality sleep is that ability to like not only power down but be supported when you get wet back up, right? You have everything you need to hit the ground running so that that time doesn't feel like a waste. And I think that's also something that we're hoping to do with the event is kind of reset how we think about rest time, that it's not wasted time, that it's actually really can be life affirming. So I'm very excited because I think we're all in need of a little repair time.
Yes, I like the idea of I'm just gonna come take a nap.
I know. Well, yeah, we have the eye masks and the ear things, and we're gonna have people can lay down. We also have a daydreaming station. I don't know what we're doing exactly with the daydreaming. I think that's not mine. It's Dr. Indar's station. But the idea of like just sitting and like thinking and like
Yeah.
meditating, not really like yoga meditating, because I sometimes find that I am a New Yorker. I don't meditate. I am noisy. I tend to be too spun. But give me free time and I'm producing. Like I'm active, but that's where I'm a very active daydreamer. So even if it
Mhm.
looks like I'm doing nothing, I'm probably up to something.
Yep,
So that's
yep.
what we want to do. Put aside a little time for those of us who are daydreamers. We're gonna have like a little writing time. You could be at like a little journal station. And the idea too is you can rotate a station. You can kind of like go in and out of a station. But I have a feeling that nap station is gonna be pretty. I think we got slippers too. Maybe we got
Ooh,
little
fun.
little slippers for the room. It's in
That's great.
Hagen too. So those of you who are in Hagen for classes, you get to kind of like, oh, this is suddenly a room I had not seen.
Get to
I had
wander up
not
there.
accessed it this way before. Um, but
That's
yeah,
great.
so
Yes, I hope everyone can join. I know it's such a busy time of the semester, but that's probably when we need it the most. So,
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
And again, sometimes when a lot of the work we do feels like battle and we don't have enough armor, I think that's what you do in the rest and repair time. It's like you kind of have to rebuild yourselves and give yourselves credit for all the work that you do and trying to like put yourself out there. So keep that in mind too. It's like it's only owed to you that you be able to take that rest time. So I was like, I think one of my students was saying, "Oh, should we meet on Friday?" And I'm like, "Mm-mm, that's recess. You stand down, take your time. You don't owe." Somebody else had asked me, they're like, "Can I submit it to you on Thursday?" I'm like, "Nope, not for Thanksgiving. No, you may not.
No.
You can hand it to me Friday or Saturday. It's okay."
Yes, looking forward to that reset.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Anything from our students? Anybody have any last minute questions? I did share in the chat the information about the event Dr. Scuro had mentioned, and there's a bunch of other things going on for Disability Awareness Month. So please, um, I'm going to put Dr. Scuro's email in the chat. So if all else fails, just shoot her a message and she can keep you up to date and let you know. But they've been blasting out through the social media on Arts and Sciences. Philosophy, I think, has their
Yeah,
own social media account.
yeah, yeah.
There's posters everywhere, there's emails, so it's definitely being blasted. So
They have them
so
up on
just
the
think
screens
about
on campus and stuff.
it. Okay.
In and if anybody's interested, we're always looking for student representatives too for Disability Awareness Month. And I think we've built a relationship with a film festival called Real Abilities, and they have all these films, everything from like the recent film was called Ezra, I think, and to more complicated films, films made by disabled people, but Real Abilities, I'll put it in the chat. We basically are going to try to host a film or a set of short films. And then there's like a Q&A with maybe the filmmaker or something like that for April, because I think it's May, early May, they have an event here, the kind of unity event where people come and they make music. And I think it's out of the music therapy program in the Rebecca Center. And
Nice.
so we're going to try to complement it with a film festival. We're going to host. So, but we haven't picked out the films. So if we have a student representative, I think they get to preview like this huge archive of films before we get to pick. So if you want to just like watch movies and like weigh in, you're more than welcome to like send me an email. And we love like student-led decisions. So
Yeah, that's
especially
great.
if you have a special area of like if you think you're going to be um, working with a certain kind of population, or if you have family members with a certain kind of disability too, we can also work around that and have you represented. Usually, like Autism Awareness Month, we try to have additional events around that April month just because. So
This was wonderful. I really enjoyed it. I know our students are very quiet today, but I'm sure they also appreciate it. Everything that we spoke about today will be archived with the first year experience. So, again, feel free if you want to watch this on the replay or have any questions. You see Dr. Scoro's email in there, my email as well. I'll just pop that in. And, feel free to reach out with any questions at all. But other than that, thank you, Dr. Scuro. This was wonderful. A great way to, I think we're about a week into Disability Awareness Month now. Is that correct? So
we get a weird week. We get
okay.
November 15 to December 15, which is
Okay. All right.
optional time because it's like finals, and so we do have stuff programmed, and that's our time to do stuff. But I think we're really open to also, like I said, it can be a year-long thing if people are really interested. We love the idea of students being more involved.
It's great. So get involved if you can. Otherwise, everyone have a wonderful Thanksgiving. I know some of you I see tomorrow, but other than that, take care, everyone. And we are back on next Monday. We have Professor Susanna Rubio from the Languages and Cultures Department. So feel free to join us for our next meeting. And thank you again. Good evening, everyone.